Osage County, Missouri, in the winter of 1874, was a country that tested everything a person thought they knew about endurance. The Gasconade River cut through the limestone bluffs in long, cold curves, and the forests of white oak and hickory that covered the ridgelines stood bare from November through March, their stripped branches making a gray lattice against a sky that withheld light the way a debt collector withholds patience. The settlers who had come into that part of Missouri in the decades before the war had built their cabins in the river bottoms and on the lower slopes where the soil was deeper, and they had learned the county's particular cruelty, that the same limestone bluffs that sheltered them from the worst of the northwest wind also trapped the cold air in the valleys, held it there through the night, and released it slowly and grudgingly in the pale hours of the morning, long after the fire had burned to ash, and the cabin had given back to the darkness every degree of warmth it had gathered through the day. It was into this landscape, on the eastern bank of a tributary called Drowned Horse Creek, that a woman named Nora Vane came in the autumn of 1871, newly married at 29, following her husband Clement to land he had purchased sight unseen from a man in St. Louis who had described it as fine bottomland with good timber. The land was what had been described, more or less, and Clement Vane was a capable man with a timber saw and a reasonable willingness to work, and in the 2 years before his death from a burst appendix in September of 1873, he had built a one-room cabin of notched white oak logs on a limestone foundation, cleared 12 acres, and planted an orchard of 8 apple trees that had not yet borne fruit. He left behind the cabin, the cleared land, the orchard, and a wife who was 31 years old, and who had, by this point, 2 full winters of Osage County experience behind her, and one question she had not yet been able to answer satisfactorily: how to keep the cabin warm through the night without waking twice to rebuild a fire that should have been able to sustain itself. Nora Vane was not a woman who asked questions she did not intend to answer. She spent the winter of 1873 as a widow, managing alone, burning through Clement's stacked wood at a rate that alarmed her, waking in the cold dark at 2 and again at 4 to feed a fire that seemed to take everything she gave it and offer back only temporary reprieve. By February of that year she had developed a theory. By March she had confirmed it. And by the following autumn, the autumn of 1874, when her neighbors on Drowned Horse Creek began to notice something unusual happening at the Vane property, she had spent the better part of 6 months acting on what she had figured out in a way that her neighbors could observe plainly and could not, for the life of them, make sense of. What they saw was this: Nora Vane, widowed at 31, was hauling river stone. The stone she was pulling from the creek bed was limestone, the flat-sided kind that the Gasconade country produced in abundance, slabs and blocks of it in every size from a dinner plate to a door, and she was hauling it in a 2-wheeled cart that she had modified herself to carry heavier loads, and she was making 4 and sometimes 5 trips a day from the creek bank to her cabin, a distance of roughly 300 yards over uneven ground. She did this through August and September and into October, through heat that made the work punishing, and into the first cool weeks of autumn when the work became merely hard. Her nearest neighbor, a man named Aldous Fry, who ran a small sawmill a 1/4 mile upstream, watched her make this journey so many times that he eventually stopped what he was doing and walked down to ask her what she intended. She told him she was lining the walls. He looked at the cart and at the stone and at the cabin behind her and asked her what she meant by that. And she told him she was setting the stone against the interior face of the cabin walls, floor to ceiling, the full interior perimeter, bedded in clay mortar from the creek bank. Aldous Fry turned this information over for a moment. He was a practical man with a working knowledge of construction, and what she was describing struck him as several things simultaneously: structurally unnecessary, physically exhausting, and almost certainly pointless as a strategy for warmth, since stone, in his experience, was cold. He said so. He said that stone held cold the same as it held heat, and that lining the inside of a cabin with it would give her cold walls in winter and cool walls in summer. And he was not sure what she was trying to accomplish, but he did not think she was accomplishing it. Nora listened to this without visible distress. She thanked him for his opinion. She picked up the cart handles and walked back toward the creek for another load. By the time the stone lining was finished in the last week of October, Aldous Fry had described it to every person he encountered at the Bonnet's Mill trading post and at the church social at St. Thomas Parish, and the general view that had formed was sympathetic and slightly despairing. The widow Vane had worked herself half to death hauling stone for no good reason in the hottest months of the year. She had a cabin full of rock now, which would take up space and hold cold and give her less room to move and no additional warmth. Several women had offered to speak with her. Several men had shaken their heads with the particular expression reserved for grief-addled thinking. A farmer named Wesley Cobb, who owned the largest holding on the creek and whose opinion on practical matters carried something close to legal authority in that small community, had ridden past the Vane cabin in September and observed the work in progress, and had said, loudly enough to be heard, which was his habit, that a woman who hauled stone into her house in August would be hauling it back out in March when she realized what she had done. He was 62 years old and had been farming in Osage County for 30 years and had never been wrong about anything practical in anyone's memory. And this gave his assessment a weight that settled over the community's opinion of Nora Vane's project like the first frost of the season, final, complete, and cold. What Wesley Cobb did not know, and what Aldous Fry did not know, and what none of Nora's neighbors on Drowned Horse Creek had any particular way of knowing, was where Nora Vane had come from before Missouri. She had been born in 1842 in the Ohio River Valley, near the town of Gallipolis, to a family of German immigrants named Brandt, who had come to America in 1836 when Nora's father was 19 years old. Her father, Heinrich Brandt, had been apprenticed as a young man to a mason in the Rhineland, a man whose family had been building with stone in the Rhine Valley for 3 generations, and who had passed to his apprentices not merely the techniques of stonework, but the philosophy behind them. The understanding that stone was not simply a building material, but a thermal instrument, that its weight and density made it behave in ways that timber never could, that a properly built stone structure did not merely contain heat, but stored it, held it, returned it slowly into the space it occupied over a period of hours that extended well beyond the life of the fire that had produced the original warmth. Heinrich Brandt had built his Ohio farmstead from the limestone his land provided, and he had built it the way his master in the Rhineland had taught him, with the stone on the inside of the structure facing the living space, positioned to receive and hold the heat from the central hearth. He had explained this to his daughter not as a building technique, but as a fact of the physical world, the way you explain to a child that water flows downhill, not as a rule to be memorized, but as an observation to be understood. Stone drinks heat. It drinks it slowly, and it gives it back slowly, and the giving back happens in the hours after the fire has died, in the dark and cold of the deep night, which is precisely when you need it most. Nora had grown up sleeping in a stone-lined house on winter nights and waking to walls that were still warm to the touch at 4 a.m, hours after her father had banked the fire. She had understood from childhood that this was not magic and not luxury, but physics. The same physics that made a cast-iron skillet hold its heat long after it left the fire. The same physics that made a river stone warm to the feet hours after the afternoon sun had moved off it. Dense material stored thermal energy. The denser the material, the more it stored. The more it stored, the longer the release. It was a principle as simple and as well established as anything in the natural world, and it had been applied in stone buildings across Europe for centuries before the first timber cabin was ever notched on American soil. What she was doing to her cabin on Drowned Horse Creek was not an experiment. It was a translation, the same knowledge her father had built his Ohio farmhouse from, adapted to the materials available in Osage County limestone country, applied to the specific problem of a one-room timber cabin that lost its heat before morning. The stone would line the walls floor to ceiling, 2 courses deep where she could manage it, bedded in clay that would seal the gaps and bind the mass into a continuous thermal surface. The fire would burn through the evening, the stone would drink, the fire would be banked at 10 o'clock, and the stone would spend the next 14 hours giving back what it had taken, slowly, steadily, into the sealed space of the cabin, into the air her sleeping children breathed, into the floor and the furniture and the darkness of the deep Missouri winter night. She had 2 children by this point, a daughter, Clara, who was 4 years old, and a son, August, who was 2. They were the reason she had hauled 5 cartloads of riverstone a day through the August heat. They were the reason she had mixed clay mortar with her hands until her palms cracked. They were the reason she had not stopped when Aldous Fry told her it wouldn't work, and had not stopped when Wesley Cobb's opinion arrived at her door wrapped in the certainty of 30 years of Missouri farming. Her children woke cold. She intended to fix that. She had known how to fix it since she was 8 years old. She simply had not yet had the materials to do it. The principle she was applying has a name in the language of builders and engineers, though Nora Vane would not have used it. It is called thermal mass. The term describes a material's capacity to absorb heat energy and release it slowly over time, and it is the fundamental reason why stone buildings in hot climates stay cool through the day and stone buildings in cold climates stay warm through the night. The mass does not generate heat, it stores it. It acts, in the simplest possible terms, as a battery for warmth. The distinction between storing heat and generating heat is the distinction between Nora Vane's approach and every approach her neighbors were using. The conventional response to a cold cabin in 1874 Missouri was to burn more wood. The logic was direct and not unreasonable. Heat comes from fire comes from wood, therefore more wood means more heat. The problem with this logic was that it treated the cabin as a container with a hole in it, a space that could only be kept warm by continuously adding warmth as fast as it escaped. A timber cabin, even a well-chinked one, was exactly this. Timber has very low thermal mass. It absorbs almost no heat. Every degree of warmth in a timber cabin is in the air, and when the fire dies and the air begins to cool and the night presses in against the walls, that warmth is gone inside of an hour or 2. Then the fire must be rebuilt, or the family must be cold. Stone behaves entirely differently. A limestone wall 6 inches thick, heated by a fire through an evening, will hold a meaningful portion of that heat for 8, 10, sometimes 14 hours, releasing it back into the room at a rate slow enough to be felt, but not fast enough to exhaust itself in an hour. The fire heats the stone. The stone heats the room. The fire goes out. The stone continues. The room, in the deep cold hours when the air outside is at its worst, and the fire is ash, and the family is at its most vulnerable, is warmer than it has any right to be by the logic of timber construction, because the logic of timber construction does not account for what is sitting behind the timber, patient and dense and full of heat it absorbed 6 hours ago and is only now beginning to return. What Nora had built by lining her timber cabin walls with 2 courses of Gasconade limestone, floor to ceiling, was a thermal battery. The timber walls stopped the wind. The stone behind the timber stored the heat. The clay mortar sealed the joints and created a continuous mass rather than a collection of individual stones. The total surface area of stone inside that one-room cabin, when the lining was complete, was something close to 400 square feet. That was 400 square feet of material that would absorb heat all evening and release it all night, and it would do this every night of the winter without firewood and without waking and without the particular dread of the 2 o'clock darkness when the cold has crept back in and the children are too cold to sleep and the wood is too wet from the morning snow to catch cleanly. Her neighbors thought she had lined her walls with cold stone. She had lined her walls with stored heat. The first hard test came in the 2nd week of December, 1874, on a night when the temperature in the Gasconade Valley dropped to 11 degrees below zero and the creek froze from bank to bank for the first time that season. Aldous Fry woke twice that night to rebuild his fire and burned through what he estimated at 3 times his usual nightly allotment of wood. Wesley Cobb's hired man stoked the fire at midnight and again at 3:30 in the morning in the large farmhouse at the top of the creek, and even so the wash basin in the back room had a skim of ice on it when the household rose at 5:30. Nora Vane banked her fire at 9:30 in the evening, when Clara and August were already asleep, and she did not rebuild it. She was not reckless. She lay in her own bed with her coat within reach, and she waited for the cold to come back in the way it always had. The gradual thickening of the air, the slow withdrawal of comfort, the moment when the blankets that were enough became not enough. She waited for an hour. She waited for 2 hours. She lay in the dark at 11:30, listening to the wind working at the corners of the cabin, and she noticed that the air was still close and warm, and she reached out her hand and pressed her palm to the stone beside the bed, and it was warm, not hot, not the fierce heat of a fire's nearness, but the steady, mild, generous warmth of something large that has been holding heat for hours and intends to keep holding it. She slept the rest of the night without waking. She rose at 5 in the morning, and the cabin was, by her estimate, warmer than it had ever been at that hour in the 2 previous winters. She could not measure this precisely. She did not have a thermometer. But she had 2 winters of reference, 2 winters of the particular cold that settled into a timber cabin by 3 in the morning, and what she woke to was not that cold. The air was breathable without the small involuntary flinch that cold air produces. August, who was 2 and who always kicked his blankets off in the night, was lying uncovered and was not shivering. She started the fire for breakfast. She pressed both palms to the stone wall beside the hearth and held them there for a moment, feeling the warmth still in it, diminished from the previous evening but present, still present, 9 hours after the fire had gone cold. 14 hours it would hold in a fully heated cabin. She knew this because she timed it, carefully, over the following weeks, building the fire in the afternoon and banking it at a consistent hour, and sitting with it through the night on the nights she chose to test it, pressing her hand to the stone every 2 hours and recording in a small notebook the quality of what she felt. Hot, warm, cool, fading, gone. 14 hours from peak fire to the last trace of warmth in the stone on the coldest nights of that Missouri winter. 14 hours in which her children slept without cold waking them. 14 hours in which no one had to rise and rebuild anything. She went through less than half the firewood her neighbors burned that winter. It was the firewood that gave it away in the end. In a community where firewood was one of the primary measures of a winter's severity and a family's prudence, the woodpile at the Vane cabin became a source of puzzlement by February. At a time of year when every other family on Drowned Horse Creek was beginning to calculate whether they had enough to last till the melt, when Aldous Fry had started rationing and Wesley Cobb had sent his hired man to fell additional timber in weather cold enough to make the work miserable, Nora Vane's woodpile looked to those who passed on the track by her property more like a November woodpile than a February one. It was not extravagant. She had not stacked more than her neighbors to begin with. She had simply burned less, and less was visible. It was Aldous Fry's wife, Margaret, who first remarked on it directly. She came to borrow a cup of rendered lard in the second week of February, and while Nora was at the larder, she looked around the cabin with the natural assessment of a woman visiting another woman's domestic space, and what she noticed was the walls. Not the stone itself. She had known about the stone since October, but the walls, as they now were, lived in and warm, and the way the cabin felt in the way that a body registers temperature before the mind names it. She noticed that it was warmer than her own cabin. She noticed that the fire in the hearth was not large, not the working fire of a household in mid-February, but a moderate, unhurried fire that looked like an afternoon fire rather than a survival fire. She asked Nora directly, "Was the stone working?" Nora said that it was. Margaret Fry sat down at the table with her cup of lard and asked Nora to tell her how, and Nora did in the plain, patient way she had explained things since childhood, starting with what stone does and why, then describing what she had built and how, then addressing directly the question of why cold stone became warm stone and how long warm stone stayed warm and what that meant for a family sleeping through a Missouri February night. Margaret listened without interrupting, which was not her habit, and when Nora finished, she sat for a moment and then said that she wished she had asked in October. Nora said that October was not far off and that she would show her the construction directly if she wanted, and that the stone was free from the creek and the clay was free from the bank, and the only thing it cost was time. Wesley Cobb came in March, the first mild day, when the worst of the winter was clearly past and the creek was beginning to talk under its ice again. He came on foot without his horse, which was unusual, and he came alone, which was more unusual still, and he stood in the yard for a moment before Nora appeared at the door and invited him in. He had not been inside the cabin before. He looked at the walls immediately, the way everyone did who had heard about them. Taking in the two courses of flat limestone from floor to ceiling, the clay-filled joints, the way the stone followed the interior perimeter of the cabin without gap or interruption. Then he crossed to the nearest wall and did what Corvin Dahl would do in Minnesota 16 years later. What every person who has heard the explanation and not quite believed it does when they finally stand in front of the thing itself. He pressed his palm flat against the stone. It was a mild day in early March. The fire had been built that morning and was burning low at midday. The outside air was 34 degrees, and the sun was out for the first time in weeks. The stone was warm. Not residual warmth, warm. Not the last trace of something fading. Warm, holding. Still doing what it had been doing since October. Wesley Cobb stood with his hand on the wall and did not speak for a long time. When he turned around, Nora was standing near the table watching him with the same expression she had worn in August, when Aldous Fry had told her what she was doing wouldn't work, composed, certain, and entirely without the need to say anything that the wall was not already saying for her. He asked her where she had learned this. She told him. Her father, the Rhineland, the Ohio farmhouse, the understanding of stone that her father had carried from one country to another inside his knowledge of his trade. Wesley Cobb nodded. He looked at the wall again. He said, and he said this quietly, more to the wall than to her, that he had built in this county for 30 years and had never built anything but timber, and he had never once asked whether there was another way, because timber was what everyone built with, and that had always seemed like sufficient reason. He said he supposed it was not sufficient reason. Nora said that timber was a fine material and that she was not arguing against it. She said she was merely lining the inside of hers. He almost smiled at that. He put his hat back on and thanked her for the time, and she watched him walk back up the track toward his own land. And she went inside and pressed her hand once more to the stone beside the door, which was warm, still warm, in the March morning light. By the following October, Wesley Cobb had contracted a mason to line the back wall of his farmhouse, the north-facing wall, the one that took the worst of the winter wind, with two courses of limestone quarried from his own property. He did not line the full perimeter as Nora had done, which was a compromise between the ideal and the practical, but what he built was enough to demonstrate the principle, and the winter of 1875 was the first winter in 30 years of Missouri farming that he did not wake before 4 a.m. to rebuild a fire. Aldous Fry built his version the same autumn, with Margaret directing the work and specifying the stone selection with a thoroughness that suggested she had been thinking about it since February. Their cabin was smaller than Cobb's farmhouse, and they lined 3 walls, and in the deep cold of January 1876, Margaret Fry wrote in a letter to her sister in Illinois that they had burned less firewood than in any previous winter, and that the cabin was warmer than it had ever been, and that she owed this to a widow on the creek who had spent the summer hauling stone while everyone, including Margaret herself, had shaken her head. 2 more families built versions of the stone lining in the autumn of 1875. A third attempted it in 1876 with insufficient stone and inadequate mortar, and reported mixed results, which Nora diagnosed when asked and corrected in a single afternoon, by pointing out where the thermal continuity had been broken and where additional mass was needed. By the winter of 1876, the stone-lined cabin at Drowned Horse Creek had ceased to be an object of puzzlement and had become, quietly and without ceremony, a local reference point for how to build in Osage County limestone country. Nora Vane remarried in 1878 to a man named Thomas Haig, who was a wheelwright from St. Louis and who had come to the county to be near his brother's family. He moved into the cabin on Drowned Horse Creek and noticed the walls immediately and asked about them, and she told him the same thing she had told everyone: what stone does, why it holds, how her father had understood it, what the creek provided for free. Thomas Haig listened carefully, and then said that he had never lived in a house like this one, and that he found it difficult to believe how different it was from anything he had previously known. And Nora told him that this was how houses had been built in the Rhineland for centuries, and would likely be built there for centuries more, and that the only unusual thing about the cabin on Drowned Horse Creek was that it was in Missouri. The cabin stood until 1931, when a flood from the Gasconade took the lower courses of the limestone foundation, and the structure was deemed unsafe and demolished. The stone from the interior lining was salvaged and used in a boundary wall on the property, where it remained for decades afterward, still flat and tight-bedded, still holding its joints in the clay mortar that Nora had mixed with her hands in the summer of 1874. The thing worth sitting with, when the details of the story have settled, is not the stone. It is the question. Nora Vane's neighbors were not poor thinkers. Wesley Cobb was not a fool. Aldous Fry was a capable, practical man who built things that worked. But they were asking a question that led them in one direction, and Nora was asking a different question that led her somewhere else entirely. And the difference between those two questions was not intelligence or effort or willingness to work. It was simply what they had been given to understand about how warmth worked. They had been given to understand that warmth is produced, that it comes from fire, that it must be continuously generated, that the cold is always winning and the fire is always fighting, and the family's job is to keep the fire winning through the night. This is not wrong. In a timber cabin with no thermal mass, it is precisely correct. Timber does not store. You burn or you freeze. Nora had been given to understand that warmth can be stored, that the right material, properly placed and properly heated, does not merely warm the air, but holds warmth the way a well is held water, giving it back over time at a rate you can count on through the hours when you cannot add more. This is also not wrong. It is simply a different question asked of the same physical world, and it produces a different answer. The fire and the stone are not in opposition. The fire heats the stone finishes the job. Together they cover the whole night, the fire's hours and the stone's hours, and the family sleeps through both. There may be something in your own situation that has this shape, a problem you have been solving by generating more of something when the better question is how to hold what you already have. More effort, more hours, more output, more noise. And somewhere under that, a quieter question about what kind of surface you have built inside the structure of your work, your life, your thinking, whether it is timber or whether it is stone, whether it gives back what was given to it, or whether it loses everything the moment the fire dies down. Nora Vane's father understood that stone remembers heat. He carried that understanding from the Rhineland to Ohio, and she carried it from Ohio to Missouri, and it warmed 3 children through 14 years of Osage County winters, and eventually warmed a community that had first shaken its head at the woman hauling riverstone in August. Some knowledge travels like that, slowly, through hands and generations, and the particular patience of people who understand something true before they have permission to prove it. The stone holds, the night passes, and in the morning, if you press your palm to the wall, you will feel what was given to it hours ago, still there, still warm, waiting. If this story has stayed with you, if it is pressed against something you already knew but had not yet named, share it with someone who is hauling stone while the valley watches and shakes its head. And if you have not yet found this channel, there is a story here every day. The subscribe button is below. This is a work of fiction. Nora Vane, Aldous Fry, Wesley Cobb, and all other named characters and events are invented. The thermal properties of limestone and the historical use of thermal mass in stone construction are real.